It is 10 days since the Supreme Court ruled Holyrood couldn't hold a referendum on independence without Westminster's consent. Well, this week we got the first significant piece of polling since that judgment. Now, we have to caveat, this is only one poll. It's impossible to draw any definitive conclusions from it. We always say that when we're looking at one poll. But the results of this one are pretty interesting nonetheless, with good and bad news for both independence and pro-union sides. Well, here now to go through some of the findings and hopefully give them a bit of context is Mark Diffley from the Diffley Partnership. Welcome back to the programme, Mark.
Good morning, Martin.
Right, headline figure, support for independence. A substantial lift in this poll for yes.
Yeah, I mean, once we remove the those who are undecided, the don't knows, we've got a readout of 52% in favour of independence and 48% in favour of the union. I think that's significant for two reasons. One is that it's the biggest readout in favour of independence that we've had for quite some time, and because it's the first poll, as you say, that's been done since the Supreme Court judgment of 10 days or so ago. Now, folk like me always take a step back and urge people to look at a whole suite of polls, you know, look at the last 5, look at the last 10, look at the trend, in other words. And the trend is still that we're around 50-50. But what independent supporters will be looking at and hoping as we get more polling and more data that trend will continue. We'll need to wait and see on that, but the timing of it is really, really interesting, I think, and very important.
Our eagle-eye viewers will be saying that 49, 45 and 5 adds up to 99. That's because it might be 49.2, 45.3,
exactly.
that kind of rounded down, right?
Yeah.
OK, so listen, who's voting how? Any demographic changes in this that we should know
and it's
about?
been long established, actually, that age is the biggest demographic predictor of how you view the constitutional issue. And broadly speaking, the younger you are, the more in favour of independence you are, and the older you get, the more against independence and pro-union you are. So, for example, in this latest poll, around 2/3 of the youngest cohort of voters, those aged between 16 and 24, are in favour of independence. And then if you go to the other end of the age scale, the 65 and over cohort, you flip that on its head, and it's about 1/3 in favour of independence. And it is a linear relationship. The older that you get, the more pro-union you are by and large. Right,
so no massive change to those demographics. Let's look at support for an independence referendum, which isn't always the same as support for independence. There's a change there too, isn't there? A growing feeling in Scotland that we do want one in the next year.
Yeah, and actually, you know, people like me don't get really that surprised often by polling findings, but I actually was quite surprised by this, I think, for two reasons. The biggest reason is that it seems to run counter to what we've seen in polling that had been done before the Supreme Court decision. So by and large, the polling position at that point was fairly static. About 1/3 of us thought that a referendum within the next year, which, as we recall, was the First Minister's preferred timeline option, at that point, and 2/3 of us were either wanting to kick the can down the road a little bit, or in fact never revisit the question at all. So to see that 46% in this poll actually not only favoured another referendum happening, but favoured it within the next year was quite a surprise. And actually, it's a greater proportion of the population than the 43% who opposed a referendum within the next year. So we're seeing something quite different. And again, because this is the first poll that's been done since the Supreme Court decision, it may be a reaction to that decision. And again, we have to sort of sit tight a bit and see whether this is a trend that continues.
So people may just have had their blood up after the Supreme Court's ruling. But according to this one poll, we do want a referendum soon. And if we were to have that referendum soon, the vote, according to this one poll, would quite possibly be for independence. But crucially, this poll also tells us that independence isn't an issue that's close to the front of people's minds, really, by and large.
No, what we're primarily concerned about as a population as a whole are two things. One is the current economic outlook, particularly in relation to our energy bills and our food prices and other essential prices going up, which they have been quite significantly over the last period. And the other thing, which we've just been covering, and I know you've covered on the show quite significantly of late, is the NHS. Now, we always see concern for the NHS rising at this time of year. There are always additional pressures on the service as we go into winter. But what we're seeing this year is that there is particular public concern. It really is one of the two real key issues. And actually, that's regardless of which party you support. So even SNP supporters, for example, are more concerned about the NHS and the economy than they are about the independence issue and the constitutional issue.
Right, and because when you look at support for political parties in this polling,
Yeah.
it is quite interesting too, because despite the growing support for independence, actually, while the SNP are still in front, it's Labour who are on the move.
Yeah, and this feels kind of counterintuitive, right? So as we've just been discussing, support for independence, albeit one poll, seems to be increasing a little. Support for holding a referendum seems to be increasing. And one, I think, would expect, as a result of that, that you would see the SNP surging in the polls, given the relationship between the two. But actually what we're seeing is something quite different. Now, the Labour revival in Scotland, it's not a surge, but the Labour revival has now been happening for sort of 6 or 9 months. It follows what we're seeing down south, albeit on a much smaller scale. Now, if you look at GB-wide polling, support for Labour is up about 50%. Here it's about 30%, but that's significantly up on where it was a year ago. I mean, it's almost double what it was in some polls. Now, what we saw at the beginning of this revival was that Labour going up in the polls was absolutely at the expense of the Scottish Conservatives, and support for the SNP was holding pretty flat. What we're seeing in this poll is, and we don't want to make too much of it, but support for the SNP dropping off a little. No more than that, but a little. Now, that's, I think, important for 2 reasons. One is that the next actual electoral test is going to be a Westminster general election. And the second, of course, really importantly, is this de facto referendum issue.
Yeah.
At 41%, which is where this poll suggests SNP support is,
Even with 2% of the Greens as well.
Yeah, in polling terms, that's a million miles away from 50%.
Paradoxically, if there was a referendum to be held, this poll tells us the yes side would win. A de facto referendum, they would lose. Interesting stuff.
Absolutely.
Although they could campaign by saying, look, if you're a Labour supporter, if you're a pro-independence supporter, you just can't vote Labour.
Yeah, and that's what the SNP will be hoping for. As the election gets closer, get the independence referendum dominating the issue, and some of that support will come back.
Endlessly fascinating in all of this, isn't it? But again, that caveat, it is just one poll, as people like you keep telling us. There's only one poll that really matters. The poll on the day. Mark Diffley, as ever, great to have you on the programme. Thanks very much indeed.